Thanks for all coming here to hear me talk about kind of pattern and how it might relate to permaculture. This has really come out of the fact that when I've been on permaculture courses and the subject of natural patterns come up, it's been one that I felt quite attracted to and quite interested in. It seems to be a kind of quite common passion, and you see all these different kinds of patterns, and it's exciting. But then I was sort of kind of like, oh, but I still haven't really kind of understood something about this. There's still something kind of missing about it for me. So I tried to do a bit of my own sort of journey to try and kind of understand what kind of like natural pattern meant a bit. And so really what I'm going to do today is talk about like where I'm at on that journey really. I won't say I've reached any kind of particular sort of destination, but to kind of share with you some of that. In Bill Mollison's Permaculture Designer's Manual, he has a kind of chapter dedicated to patterns. So when I was thinking, oh, what is this thing about natural pattern and permaculture, I'll go to the source and look that up. And almost one of the first things that Bill Mollison says there is, this is a really important subject, and I really didn't want to have to write about it. Which I think was kind of an awareness that it was such a big, potentially big subject in a way that it was quite hard to kind of grasp about it. And to tell you the truth, like I still find like his chapter on pattern largely impenetrable. So it didn't become a very useful source for me in thinking about pattern and permaculture. So I thought rather than be put off by this, I would try to find my own kind of way in there, find something that was kind of had resonance about it for me. And at the beginning of that was this kind of question about like what actually are patterns, what defines a kind of pattern, and quickly realised that people were talking about kind of patterns in lots of different kinds of ways. So I mean, these are kind of patterns. I mean, can anybody recognise what this was? Yeah, what about that?
Apple.
Or that?
McDonald's.
That one?
Facebook.
Yeah, that one.
Volkswagen. Nike.
Yeah. But these. Three votes for. It's still a bit vague down here, don't they? Yeah. Not doing too bad here, but there was a general kind of like not so enthusiastic about answering as we were about the first here. And yet we have this part of our brain that kind of recognises loads of these sort of things. In fact, kind of like pattern is kind of really built into our way of thinking. We're kind of pattern recognising, pattern making creatures. But now an awful lot of part of our brain becomes kind of interested in this sort of stuff, and so that we can kind of recognise loads of these, and we look at, a lot of us can look at this and think, I don't really know what it is that I'm looking at there. Plants, flowers. So this kind of poses me a question like, what exactly is it that we're loving? When we look at these kind of patterns and shapes out there. And so key to this, I think, is this idea of pattern literacy, about being kind of literate in kind of patterns, recognising and understanding them. And so when I tried to find an inroad into this, something that kind of gave me some way of kind of grasping this, I came across a book by an American ecologist called Tyler Volk. He wrote this book called Metapatterns. I thought, oh, that sounds really good. That sounds like it's got really going to have a kind of shit in it. And its kind of subtitle is something like of space, time, and mind. And this was quite a useful kind of way for me to start to kind of understand the different ways that people were talking about patterns. There were kind of spatial patterns, and temporal patterns, and there were also like mental and psychological patterns. And any of you that were in Lumi McNamara's talk earlier today about kind of people care might have heard her talk about kind of how patterns of behaviour and sort of bad habits and kind of or good habits. And in fact, like all of our sense of pattern is really kind of coming from that mind, kind of deciphering it. So Tyler Volk goes into all three of these categories. I don't really have time to do that today, so I'm going to concentrate just on the kind of spatial element of patterns in space, by which I don't mean outer space, although that is a picture of outer space. I think of physical space, although we can see a spiral pattern in space there. And on permaculture courses, when patterns talked about, it's often patterns like the spiral which kind of come up, sort of like the spiral, branching patterns, lobes, networks. They kind of like sound kind of groovy, slightly psychedelic kind of things, sound exciting in a way. I'm not going to talk about those patterns. Because after reading Tyler Volk's book, I kind of realised that there actually are some more basic elements to pattern before those more exciting ones, and that I realised it was really useful to try and understand those before we try and understood those other ones. Okay, so possibly the most common pattern or shape in the universe is spheres. What I'd like to do now here actually is to kind of hand out some kind of modelling clay. Not to you guys, we can take a bit and pass it along. And this, for the purposes of this, is the sort of primordial stuff of the universe. And start kind of working that through in your hand to kind of get a sense of the stuff of the universe. That image on the screen here is kind of an attempt to kind of depict in that top left corner there the idea of the hydrogen atom. Now, when we talk about the shapes of atoms, we're getting into a kind of strange sort of area. Passing around to the back. Because it's difficult to actually kind of see, but the general kind of model of the atom, and actually sort of over here, these are kind of images of kind of atoms. It's the basically kind of sort of spherical shape, and the hydrogen atom is the most basic of the atoms. And when we look out into space using our instruments, about somewhere 80% plus of what the observable mass of the universe is hydrogen, is kind of made of these quite basic spheres. This is quite a big ball of hydrogen. I don't know if anyone recognises this one. This is our sun, 93 million miles away. But we've sort of moved from that kind of like micro kind of scale to the kind of like quite macro scale. We kind of see this kind of same shape sort of appearing there. And I think you might start to notice when you start kind of forming the primary mass of the cosmos that it does quite naturally kind of it's quite easy to make this shape in it. So there's one, there's home, kind of the blue marble. So we kind of live on a sphere as well as kind of observing the spheres. This is another blue marble. This is a kind of human egg cell. You see a few kind of sperm trying to make their inroads there. So both on the kind of sort of on the kind of physical in the physical world and in the biological world, the kind of sphere appears quite a lot. And these kind of patterns appear like both in the kind of the biophysical world, in the kind of the mineral world. We see it in both plants and in animals, in flora and fauna. And there's a kind of idea here of in science of convergence. These things aren't they're not related by very close genetics or anything. They're not all in the same environments, but they are kind of finding the same sort of shape. There's some more eggs there, frog spawn. These are slugs' eggs. Find any of these in the garden. So there's some particular qualities of the sphere which make it something that kind of life likes to go towards. I just want to note here as well that kind of when we talk about sphere, a lot of people kind of look at things and go, well, that isn't a sphere. It's a bit bumpy over here, isn't that more ovoid? You know, sort of like this isn't a sphere. It's a different kind of shape. But basically, the idea of the sphere, the pure sphere, related to pi, the irrational number, is like a mental construct. It basically doesn't exist in the universe outside that. The closest thing I've been able to discover to a perfect sphere is a stationary neutron star. which I think is a fairly theoretical kind of idea. So basically, when we're talking about we're talking about sphericity, we're talking about moving towards the qualities of a sphere. And there are two main qualities to a sphere. For any given volume, it has the minimum surface area that that volume can have. This means it kind of what's inside has the least contact with the outside. Basically, that. Anybody think any reasons why that might be? Why might you want to minimise your contact with the outside? Protection, yeah. Yeah, because the outside world can be quite dangerous. And actually, one of the places we see the sphere quite a lot, as we can see here, is in young organisms. So like in kind of like eggs of all kinds. So we've got those like frog spawn and slug eggs. And kind of the shape. Some animals' eggs are more spheroid than this, but even you can see this is approaching kind of sphericity. But you also get it in the kind of the young part, the reproductive parts of things. So when we look at fruit, we quite common see this shape in a kind of plum there, in a kind of melon. You can even see kind of like the mushroom, which is this is like the fruiting body of the mushroom, sort of moving towards sphericity. And you see it in flower buds, and you see it in leaf buds, because these are the young parts of the organism need the most protection. And so by minimising the contact with the outside world, you allow it to kind of like enjoy part of its growth in the most protected form. So they're talking about that flower bud there. You see in kind of lots of seed shapes as well, pollen. This is actually pollen of another gardener's favourite, bindweed. You see there the apple and kind of globe artichoke, they're all kind of like sharing this sort of tendency towards sphericity. We usually see in kind of like nest formations as well, offering a kind of like another form of protection. So there's like a wasp orb there, and the web of an orb spider. Now, as organisms become more mature, they tend to lose their sphericity because that kind of protective aspect that they need becomes less important. And the places where this is kind of in plant world, one place where this doesn't really happen is in kind of cacti. Cacti and kind of succulent plants tend to retain more of a kind of sphericity in their shape than other plants. Anybody think why that might be?
Minimises water loss.
Yeah, minimises water loss. They're in a particular kind of environment, this kind of dry environment. They want to protect themselves from evaporation. So unlike plants in other environments, they're kind of maintaining more of this kind of shape. So in adults, we have parts of our body which need the most protection tend to have the more kind of sphericity. And there's another aspect of the sphere is that it's the strongest structure for the least material. So you've got a limited amount of material. The strongest structure you can make from that is a sphere. And so it has these kind of like structural properties of kind of resistance to the outside and of kind of providing a kind of structure. And so in the parts of the human body that we require kind of like more protection, like the brain, so you can see here. This is my left retina, the eye is another kind of sort of orbital thing. If I should look away now, I'd be not too happy with the human body because there are other parts of the human body that are sensitive and benefit from the protection of the spherical shape. This is not me, this is from Wikipedia, where it's, I think copyright is a photographer's own, so I think bravo, that man there, contributing to the world's knowledge on Wikipedia. So we're all kind of aware of these parts of the body that are kind of the more sensitive kind of stuff, and they're using that kind of like least amount of surface area, kind of like protecting it inside there. Again, we see it on the micro kind of scale. It's kind of an immune cell in our blood, and some things don't necessarily have the spherical shape, but will assume it. So kind of like the kind of hedgehog where it kind of rolls itself in, or in this case, a woodlouse. So often we kind of see an aspect of the spherical quality in things. And the kind of the dome, which is kind of almost like sort of half of this, we squeeze this against a kind of flat surface. Now, kind of dome, if you've got a flat surface to build on, the dome becomes the strongest material for the least surface rather than the sphere, because you're actually using something that's there already. So this is kind of it's a way of kind of minimising the amount of material that you want to use for structural properties. So it's very energy efficient. The sphere and the dome are both energy efficient things, and nature is always trying to move towards kind of like the most efficient way of doing things. So we see it in the kind of bug shape of the bug, ladybird. We can see it in the kind of protective shell here, the kind of tortoise, obviously in the kind of turtle and the other kind of things like that. You see it in the kind of nut form as well, kind of like sort of pistachio, walnuts here. And humans have used this kind of shape as well. So a couple of kind of famous buildings here, the Blue Mosque in Istanbul and the mosque and the Temple of the Mount in Jerusalem. And it represents something that I'm not really going to go into here about kind of some of the kind of cultural elements of some of these kind of shapes. The kind of, especially the circle and the sphere, they have this kind of common reappearance in kind of spiritual traditions. And they kind of the idea of the kind of vault of heaven. And that's why they often appear in these kind of spiritual kind of buildings. But they're kind of real, they have this massive kind of ability to contain space with the least amount of material, which is why kind of builders like them. And people often talk about the kind of arch and the strength of the arch. The dome is almost like it's like an arch, and then you move it through dimensions like that. So you imagine an arch, and you keep building it around like that. You kind of got this sort of dome shape. You've got amazing structural properties. So here's a kind of dome closer to home for us, the dome of St Paul's Cathedral during the Occupy movement. Down here you can see dome tents. This is quite a kind of common tent formation. So kind of, and it's using the same kind of principle, kind of minimal material, large area covered. It's quite a nice space, and you get quite a good tent in the dome tent. Graham will recognise that. Graham's there. So we kind of see these in kind of very different places. And this kind of goes back quite a long way in human culture. This is in a museum in Kiev in the Ukraine. This is a kind of dome structure which is about 12,000 years old, which was found in the Ukraine using kind of mammoth tusks and bones. They're kind of using the kind of natural curves in the kind of structure of that kind of animal in order to benefit from that dome structure, for the kind of capacity they're using, the kind of structural properties, and they've got that large living space in there. And I recently read there's been some archaeological discoveries of Neanderthal settlements that seem to using a similar structure to this, that maybe like 20,000 years old, so sort of pretty early in kind of in Homo culture. This is a kind of bender, which some of you may know, a sort of quite traditional structure. Probably kind of early humans, quite difficult to get the amount of mammoth bones and tusks together to build something out of mammoth tusks, but quite easy to get enough kind of wood, put it in the ground, bend it over, tie it to another piece, create a dome structure like that, cover it with animal hide or brash or something. And probably many of the early human structures were using this kind of dome thing. Which I think is quite a reminder that we're not separate from nature, we are part of nature, we engage in all of these same sort of techniques. Okay, so the next kind of Tyler Volk's meta-patterns that I talk about is the kind of sheet. So basically we've got our kind of like balls or whatever here. If you've still got one of these, if you kind of like squash this down, try and flatten this out here, kind of stretch it out, so you kind of see how big a flat thing you can get here. This is sort of basically, we're moving from the ball, so we're now taking the cosmic stuff, the universe, we're moving from that ball, that spherical shape, into a sheet form. And the sheet form, in some ways, is kind of the opposite of the spherical form. So with the spherical form, we were trying to minimise the surface area to the volume. With the kind of sheet form here, we're doing the opposite, we're kind of maximising that. We're trying to kind of get more surface area. And we often see this in nature, where it's trying to create a transfer medium, where you want to transfer energy or material So the classic form of this, of course, is the leaf. There's a set of transfers happening in a leaf. Anybody know any sort of things that are happening on a leaf? Photosynthesis, yeah. So having a kind of big leaf there is creating a larger area for sunlight to hit, more photons are hitting, allowing more photosynthesis to happen. So in the leaf form, it wants to kind of like maximise this surface area. But also some other things are being transferred across this surface. Transpiration, yes. Yeah, so we've got, there's a couple of things there. So we've got the movement of kind of gases. So generally on the underside of the leaf, we've got kind of this relationship with the atmosphere with kind of carbon dioxide moving in. And then we also get kind of like water moving up through the plant, coming there. So other kind of sheet form is the wing. And this is also doing a transfer. It's a sort of transfer of energy. And it's using, again, you want this kind of large surface area to kind of move this kind of air around to kind of create the lift. It's kind of the kinetic energy from the biological processes of digestion inside to get this kind of lift up into the air. Obviously, it's in a range of different animals, not just birds and insects. We also see this sort of sheet form. We often don't see it, but it's kind of there in kind of fluids in the atmosphere and in water. So some of you may have had that experience of when you're kind of swimming, that you sort of dive down and you come into a bit of water which is a different temperature. You actually get these sort of different kind of sheets of water. You also get this in the atmosphere. And sometimes we see this kind of sheet formation. It's basically this is the point at which water vapour is starting to come into that cloud form. The temperature drops and it kind of like becomes into droplets from gas. So it's another place we see the sheet form. But like the kind of bird's wing, obviously like the opposite of the bird wing, where the bird or the insect wing is kind of that transfer medium of that energy kind of being used to move the air around. Humans have got quite good at reversing that process, taking movement in the air and turning that into kinetic energy to use. So obviously we've kind of seen that in transportation, in like ships where the kind of sail becomes a way of capturing that energy, using the sheet form to kind of transfer it into a movement forward. And in wind turbine, a windmill in this case, but also in a kind of electric generating windmill, also in a kind of hydroelectric kind of rotor. You kind of see how it's kind of capturing that energy using a kind of sheet to kind of like, okay, I'm going to get in the way of this and transfer that kind of energy. Okay, so the third and kind of last form of Tyler Volk that I'm talking about is kind of tubes or cylinders. So if we still got our sheet here, it's almost like we can imagine we start to roll this over. You get a form that's sort of maybe like that or something. And this has got some properties of the sheet and some properties of the sphere. It's got a smaller surface area than the sphere, but it's not containing as much volume. It's got a smaller surface area than the sheet, but it's not containing as much volume as the sphere. And the tube is often, if the sheet was about kind of like sort of transfer of energy, so the tube tends to be about kind of transportation. So the classic form of this is in a kind of like a sort of tree trunk that we see. And the sort of transportation happening within that. We know what sort of things are being transported.
Water.
Yeah, water. Yeah, sort of nutrients. So we kind of see this shape kind of replicated in the roots and in the branches. And so it's kind of like it's transferring kind of material kind of up, back and forth through here. And it also has some particular kind of properties in terms of its sort of surface area. That, if we look at it like this, it has particular qualities. But if we look at it like this, it has a different kind of quality. So it's got a different amount of surface area here than here. And this is quite good if you want to move through a kind of medium that's resisting you. So when roots, like of a plant or like mycelium of kind of fungi, they tend to have this kind of shape. So as they're moving through, if you want to move through the soil, if you want to try and move this through soil, it's quite energetic to try and do that. You've got quite a lot of resistance. But to move like this through soil, is a lot easier. So you're kind of carrying all this material kind of through and kind of using less energy. And so we also see this shape in a lot of forms of, so we see it in kind of like snakes and worms, kind of in the animal world that do the same sort of thing. That's mycelium there, trunk of a tree, grasses, worms. We also see this in some of our forms of transportation, that where, I don't know, can anyone think of any things we used to move around in that like have more of this kind of shape? Trains, yeah, especially tube trains. Yeah, so I mean trains in general, so they've got this smaller surface area, so the mount's being pushed through. Also like a plane, it has these kind of, it's using the sheet form in terms of the wings, but if you look at the fuselage, where most of the kind of mass of the material is, it's kind of using the small surface area at the start there. So one of the other main things that kind of the tube form transport is kind of stresses. So it's quite a good way of kind of like movement, kind of moving, kind of distributing kind of weight through. So one of the other things that the kind of the tree trunk is doing is it's kind of it's like holding that kind of whole mass of the tree by moving the kind of energy downwards. And so we also have that in our human skeletons where we're kind of distributing the kind of weight down. What's kind of really interesting, I think, with this is when we start thinking about putting these things together. So I don't know if some of you make some balls, some of you make some sheets, and some of you make some tubes. You can kind of self-manage that too. Who's making tubes?
I'm making tubes.
Anybody else making tubes? I've got a tube. Okay, we've got some tube makers. We've got any sphere makers? Sphere makers. Okay, we're looking for that. Oh, about sheet makers. We've got any sheet makers? Okay, we've got a few. So what we kind of find, you might want to start, actually if you can start grouping together, if you can see someone's making a different shape to you, kind of gravitate towards them and kind of get your shapes together.
There you go. The words with that. What did you do? Write it round.
So, do you work out what we can do with it? Well, then it trees are sheep.
Some debates.
You have actually, would you want some?
A tree is a tube.
Okay, you need to find something with a tube. Then we've got a tube. Do you want to make it?
Yeah.
Okay, if you haven't got any clay you'd like some, I've got some more here. Or if you don't want to do that, try and find some people that are and kind of see what we've got. Okay, so does everybody kind of can see somewhere where there's a tube, a sheet, and a sphere? Okay, so do you want some things that look like this? Does this sort of kind of look like what you might got? So can anybody else think of anything else that might look like this?
Snail?
Snail?
Yeah.
Apple tree.
What do you think?
Apple tree.
Apple tree? Anyone want to see that? That's more what I was saying for. Snails look a bit like a snail. But when you kind of see an apple tree or kind of fruit trees, what you're seeing a range of different shapes, a range of different patterns. All of it has the same DNA, it has the same genetics, but kind of manifested in different kind of ways. So we can see in an apple tree, say, or another kind of fruit form, we've got this kind of tube form, providing the kind of basic structure, the kind of the branches, the kind of stem. We've also got the kind of sheet form with the leaf. And we also have the kind of spherical form in the kind of fruit, or we also see it in the leaf bud, or in the flower bud. So what we can see here is that kind of nature is kind of like manifesting these different patterns for different design purposes, because there are different design needs that kind of nature kind of has. It needs this kind of structure to kind of reach out. It needs this kind of structure to transfer, to kind of absorb the sunlight, to transfer kind of water and carbon dioxide. And then this is this kind of reproductive kind of future, and it really wants to look after this, it wants to kind of protect this as much as it can, so it's using these different kind of shapes. And so, what I just sort of would invite you to do now is to start to look for these shapes out in nature yourself as you go around. And you can start to see that the more complicated shapes that we might have spoken about, sort of spirals, it's not my phone, the branching and spirals are actually kind of constructed of these elements. A lot of their properties are relationships about achieving these kind of properties. And the key thing that, for me, that Bill Mollison kind of said in his sorry about that. In his chapter, one thing I did get from it is that there are two important things about pattern. One is recognising the patterns that are within nature, and the other one is about kind of using pattern to achieve our ends. And so I think what this means is there's both the kind of pattern literacy, which is what we've been working with here, about kind of recognising and understanding patterns, and then there's kind of writing or expressing ourselves in a pattern language. But it's only really, you can't really write in a language until you can read it. And I think this is kind of that key thing about in permaculture, about observation, and about starting to, and I think what kind of pattern is about the next stage of observation. It's about kind of, okay, I'm looking, I'm seeing these things, and then kind of, oh, I'm seeing these things again and again, and that must be for a reason. So what might those reasons be? And it's from our observations and recognising patterns that we start to draw the kind of principles out of like how we understand kind of nature. And I think that's where we might move from to start kind of expressing ourselves or writing in a pattern language, kind of understanding the kind of the particular kind of energy efficiencies and needs that kind of nature is kind of trying to meet in the shapes that it's using. So, I don't really have any more to say about it. As I said at the start, this is kind of where I'm at in my kind of development of kind of thinking about this, and I am absolutely certain there is a lot more to know about it. But I think the more of us that are kind of thinking about these things and looking at how we might use these things, we might get a more kind of sophisticated kind of understanding of how nature works and be able to use that in our designs for our own systems. Yeah, so that I'm done. If you have any particular questions, I will do my best to try and answer. And if you have any of my Play-Doh, I invite you to smell it now, to use your olfactory sense to try and embed the knowledge. And then if you bring it back here, and I'll collect it up. But if anyone has any questions, I'll happily try and answer. Yes?
Have you written anything about all this stuff?
No.
Or got any videos?
I personally don't. I mean, pattern is a subject which is fascinating to many people. There are many different angles on it. So, I mean, if you start searching on YouTube and things, you can find plenty of video on it. I mean, I think there are a number of different angles, and some of which a bit like a rabbit hole. There's the whole idea of kind of sacred geometry, the kind of idea that there are kind of like particular kind of shapes in the universe. There's a book about it there. And there's a certain kind of, there's a cosmic importance in this, and that we actually kind of understand some of the design of the universe by looking at that. And there are things like the Fibonacci sequence or the kind of gold section repeating certain numerical forms over. But yeah, I mean it's a really big subject. But also, I mean, some people look at that not from a spiritual perspective, but there's a very interesting one actually in terms of videos called V-Heart. V is V-I, Heart is like a stag, H-A-R-T, and she's a mathematician, and she's done some videos about Fibonacci sequence and these sort of number patterns which then represent themselves in terms of shape. So I really recommend
That's
that.
very mathematically minded though. That sort of doing it in this really practical way with the Play-Doh has made it much more accessible.
It's really interesting as well, if you start to look at sacred geometry, and then you start to look through that lens at nature as well, you see like so many flowers and fruits and fractals exactly everywhere. I mean, it's amazing. So it just makes you so aware of
Okay, I think we're done.